The air on that late October morning in 1888 was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of frost and finality. On the edge of a fallow field in the Oklahoma Panhandle, a woman named Anna stood motionless, watching the wagon that held every last thing she owned shrink into the horizon. It wasn't her wagon. It belonged to the bank. Beside her, her 10-year-old son, Thomas, held her hand, his knuckles white. And sitting on a small, overturned crate, her mother, Martha, 75 years old, pulled a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed not on the departing wagon, but on her daughter's face. They had been given 1 hour to vacate the property her husband had worked to death. The hour was up. They had nothing. Nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single crate, and a decision. What happened next, on that forgotten patch of land, would become one of the quietest and most remarkable stories of survival ever lived. It's a story about what we do when the world takes everything, and what we can build when all that remains is the ground beneath our feet. If you believe such stories deserve to be remembered, we invite you to be with us for this one, and to consider subscribing, so that more of them can be told. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves of the colossal sycamore tree that stood just beyond the property line, on the unclaimed bank of a dry creek bed. It was the only thing for miles that seemed permanent. The only thing that didn't belong to the bank. It was ancient, its white branches like skeletal arms reaching for a cold, indifferent sky. And in that moment of absolute loss, as the last trace of the wagon disappeared, Anna looked at that tree, and an idea began to form. An idea so desperate, so impossible, it could only have been born in the heart of someone with nothing left to lose. She was a widow with a young son and an elderly mother. Winter was coming. And their only hope for shelter was not a house, but a tree. A hollow, broken, and yet somehow, still standing giant. The story of their ruin was a common one, written in cheap ink on brittle paper. Anna's husband, Robert, had been a good man, a strong man, but the land was stronger. A year of drought, followed by a season of fever, had taken him swiftly, leaving behind a mountain of debt he had quietly accumulated in a desperate attempt to keep them afloat. The notes were held by a bank in the nearest town, a clean building with polished windows that seemed to reflect a world far removed from the dirt and toil of the prairie. The man who managed that bank, a Mr. Finch, had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. He was not a cruel man, merely a practical one. He saw life as a ledger of assets and liabilities, and Anna was now firmly in the wrong column. He had explained the situation with a calm, clipped tone that offered no room for negotiation or appeal. The farm, the house, the mule, the tools, they were collateral. They were forfeit. Anna had listened, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of composure she did not feel. She did not plead. She did not weep. She simply absorbed the facts as if they were blows. Mr. Finch saw this stillness not as strength, but as a kind of vacancy, the quiet surrender of a person already defeated. He looked at her, at the boy at her side, at the old woman dozing in her chair by the cold stove, and he made his calculation. "You have no people to go to?" he had asked. It was not a question of concern, but of logistics. Anna shook her head. "No, sir," he nodded, as if this confirmed his assessment. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, the words a hollow formality. "The bank will be merciful. You will have until the end of the month." The end of the month was a week away. The mercy of the bank was a week. After he left, the silence in the small cabin was heavier than any sound. The stakes were not complicated. They were primal. Without shelter, the coming winter would not be a hardship, it would be a death sentence. As dusk began to bleed across the plains, turning the pale sky to bruised lavender and deep orange, the cold sharpened its teeth. The three of them were still there, beside the great sycamore. The wind was a low moan through its bare branches. To stay out in the open was impossible. The nearest town was a 10-mile walk, a journey Martha could not make, and a place where they had no friends, no money, and no prospects but the charity of strangers who had little enough for themselves. Anna walked over to the tree. It was immense, the circumference of its trunk wider than she was tall. Long ago, perhaps a century before she was born, lightning had struck its heart. The fire had burned it out from the inside, leaving a gaping, dark opening at its base, a wound that had scarred over with thick, gnarled bark. The tree had not died. It had kept growing around its own emptiness, creating a hollow chamber within its living walls. She peered inside. It was dark, filled with a thick carpet of rotted leaves and the debris of ages. It smelled of damp earth, of decay, and of life. It was a den for an animal, not a home for a family. But it was shelter. It was something. She turned to her mother. Martha had risen from the crate and shuffled over, her old eyes, cloudy with age, assessing the same impossible space. Anna expected protest, or perhaps the quiet despair that had been settling over them for weeks. Instead, the old woman reached out a trembling, papery hand and laid it on the rough bark of the sycamore. She ran her palm over its surface, as if reading a story written in a language only she could understand. A tree with a strong heart can stand, even when it's empty, Martha said, her voice a dry whisper. It was the most she had said all day. It was not advice. It was a verdict. It was permission. Thomas, seeing their attention fixed on the opening, crept closer. For him, the loss of their home was a confusing, abstract sorrow. But a hollow tree? That was an adventure. We could live in here, he said, his voice filled with a child's simple, uncomplicated logic. And that was all it took. The decision was not debated. It was settled. The world had cast them out, so they would step out of the world. They would make their home not on the land, but in it. The first few days were a blur of relentless, punishing labor. The hollow space inside the sycamore was larger than it appeared from the outside, a rough, circular room perhaps 10 feet across, tapering as it rose 20 feet to an opening in the canopy where a great limb had once been torn away. But it was filthy, choked with years of damp, decaying leaves, fallen branches, and the nests of countless small creatures. Anna worked with a silent, focused fury. Using a broken shovel head she'd found by the creek bed and her bare hands, she began to excavate the space. She hauled out bucket after bucket of wet mulch, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands quickly blistering and then bleeding. Thomas worked alongside her, his small frame straining as he dragged the debris away from the entrance. He never complained. He worked with the solemn dedication of a boy who understood, on some deep, unspoken level, that this was not a game. While they cleared the interior, Martha, too frail for heavy lifting, found her own purpose. She gathered the long, tough grasses that grew along the dry creek, her gnarled fingers patiently weaving them into thick, durable mats. It was a skill from a forgotten youth, a muscle memory that returned to her as if it had never left. She sat on her crate, her back against the warm bark of the tree, and she wove. She wove floor coverings to keep them from the damp earth. She wove smaller mats to hang against the inside of the trunk, a fragile barrier against the cold that would soon be their constant companion. A mile away, the collapsed remains of an old homesteader's shed, long since abandoned, offered a small miracle. Anna found a pile of weathered, but still solid, oak planks. Over 2 days, she carried them, one by one, back to the tree. With Thomas's help, she managed to wedge and fit them into the base of the hollow, creating a crude but level floor that lifted them off the cold ground. They used a mixture of clay from the creek bank and dried moss to chink the gaps in the trunk, sealing the smaller holes against the wind. Every action was deliberate, every resource scavenged and repurposed. As they worked, the tree began to change. It was no longer just a hollow trunk. It was becoming a home, shaped not by saws and nails, but by sheer, desperate will. It was their fortress. Their sanctuary. Their last stand against the coming winter. Word of their strange new dwelling traveled on the wind. A family living in a tree was a curiosity, a piece of gossip traded over fence posts and in the town's general store. Most dismissed it as a sad, temporary folly. A few found it pitiable. No one offered to help. One afternoon, Mr. Finch rode out on his horse, ostensibly to inspect the boundaries of the bank's newly acquired property. He reined in his horse a short distance from the sycamore, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disdain. Anna was outside, patching a section of the trunk with a mud plaster, her face and clothes smeared with dirt. She did not stop her work. She did not acknowledge him. He watched her for a long moment, his lip curled in a slight sneer. He saw a woman clinging to a foolish, undignified fantasy. He saw weakness. He did not see the iron resolve that was hardening within her, forged in grief and hammered into shape by necessity. He finally spoke, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Mrs. Sutton," he called out, his tone laced with a condescending authority. "This is not a sustainable arrangement." Anna paused, wiping a strand of hair from her face with the back of a muddy hand. She looked at him, her gaze level and unreadable. "It is what we have, Mr. Finch." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of paternalistic disappointment. "Nature is not sentimental. The first snow will prove me right. You have a mother and a son to consider. This is no place for them. You'll be gone by first snow," he predicted, not as a threat, but as an inescapable fact. "Or you'll be frozen." He turned his horse and rode away without another word, convinced he had delivered a final, unassailable truth. His words hung in the air, an open loop of dread. That same week, a man named Samuel, a trapper who lived a solitary life in the hills, passed by on his way to check his lines. He was a quiet, practical man who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. He saw the smoke curling from the top of the hollow trunk, saw the neatly woven mats drying in the sun, and saw the determined set of Anna's jaw as she worked. He was a skeptic by nature and trade. He knew the cold. He knew how it found every crack, how it stole warmth and life with a patient, relentless efficiency. He thought they were fools. But unlike Mr. Finch, he saw something else in their folly. He saw a fight. He didn't speak to them. He just watched from a distance for a time, his weathered face betraying nothing, and then he moved on, the image of the woman, the boy, and the old woman making their impossible home in the heart of a tree lodged in his mind. He expected to find them gone, or worse, the next time he passed. The sky had been a flat, metallic gray for 3 days. A deep, penetrating cold had settled over the land, a cold that felt ancient and predatory. Then, one afternoon in late November, the first flakes began to drift down. They were small and hesitant at first, then larger, thicker, coming faster and faster until the world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The blizzard arrived not with a roar, but with a suffocating silence. The wind, which had been a constant whisper for weeks, rose to a high, vicious shriek, tearing at the branches of the sycamore. This was the test. This was the moment Mr. Finch had prophesied. Inside the tree, the world was reduced to a small circle of dim, flickering light. They had built a small fire pit in the center of the floor, directly beneath the opening high above, which now served as a natural chimney. A small pile of scavenged firewood, gathered painstakingly over the past month, was their lifeline. Anna, Martha, and Thomas huddled together, wrapped in their thin blankets and Martha's woven mats. The cold was a physical presence. It pressed in from all sides, a constant, draining pressure. The mud and moss chinking helped, but drafts of icy air still snaked through unseen cracks in the ancient wood. The sound of the wind was terrifying, a relentless assault that made the very trunk of the tree groan and shudder around them. They did not speak much. Words were an expense of energy they could not afford. Every few hours, Anna would add another small piece of wood to the fire, carefully husbanding their meager supply. Martha, her breath misting in the frigid air, seemed to retreat into herself, her eyes closed, as if conserving her life force. Thomas, wedged between his mother and grandmother, shivered, but he did not cry. He watched the flames dance, his young face illuminated by the firelight, a mask of quiet endurance. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights. Time lost its meaning. There was only the howling of the wind, the biting cold, and the small, defiant glow of their fire. In those long, dark hours, huddled in the heart of the tree, they were no longer just a family. They were a single, breathing organism, sharing warmth, sharing silence, sharing the simple, brutal will to see the sun again. The tree held them. It absorbed the fury of the storm, its massive trunk a shield against the world. They were surviving. Moment by moment, breath by breath, they were proving the world wrong. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to an almost profound silence. The wind had died. A pale, watery light filtered down from the opening above, illuminating a chamber that was achingly cold but still. They were alive. Anna pushed aside the heavy hide she had hung over the entrance and looked out upon a transformed world. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The landscape was a sea of white, beautiful and deadly. The air was so cold it burned to breathe, but it was still. The storm had passed. Later that day, a figure appeared, moving slowly through the deep snow. It was Samuel, the trapper. He had been checking his lines when the blizzard hit, forcing him to take shelter in a small lean-to. He had been thinking of them, the strange family in the tree. He had been certain the storm would be the end of them. He expected to find the entrance drifted over, their small fire long dead. He was walking toward them not out of hope, but out of a grim duty to confirm the inevitable. He stopped about 20 yards from the sycamore, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The entrance was clear. A thin tendril of smoke was rising from the top of the trunk. As he watched, Anna emerged, carrying a bucket to gather snow for water. She saw him and paused. They looked at each other across the expanse of white. No words were exchanged. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, grudging astonishment. He had come expecting to find tragedy and had found resilience instead. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to leave, then stopped. Without looking back, he unslung a pair of rabbits from his belt and laid them carefully on a clean patch of snow. Then he continued on his way, disappearing into the trees. It was more than just food. It was a concession. It was an offering of respect. It was the first crack in the wall of their isolation. Samuel's skepticism had been weathered away by the storm, replaced by a quiet admiration for the sheer stubbornness of their survival. The reluctant ally was now, simply, an ally. His small gesture was a signal, a message to the silent, watching world that the family in the sycamore tree was not a tragedy in the making, but a force to be reckoned with. That first brutal winter was not the end of their story, but the beginning. They survived it, and in doing so, they became something other than outcasts. They became a legend. As spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing the prairie back to life, Anna, Martha, and Thomas did not leave their tree. It was their home now, earned through hardship and resilience. Anna cleared a small patch of land near the creek and planted a garden with seeds Samuel had quietly left for them one morning. She cultivated rows of beans, squash, and corn, tending to them with the same fierce dedication she had used to build their shelter. Thomas, under Samuel's quiet tutelage, learned the ways of the land. He learned to read tracks, to find edible roots, to understand the rhythms of the seasons. He grew lean and self-reliant, a boy shaped by the wild, his classroom the forest and the creek. The tree house, as it came to be known, ceased to be a subject of pity or scorn. It became a landmark. People from the town would sometimes ride out, not to gawk, but to look upon it with a kind of quiet wonder. They saw the neat garden, the smoke rising from the trunk, the old woman weaving in the sun, and the woman whose hands had built it all. They saw not poverty, but an almost defiant abundance. Mr. Finch saw it too. He would occasionally pass on his horse, his face a mask of stern disapproval. He never spoke to them again. Their continued existence was a silent rebuke to his practical, calculated world. He had predicted their failure, and their survival was an untidy fact that did not fit on his ledger. He could not comprehend it, and so he chose to ignore it. The family in the tree never sought acceptance from the community, but in time, it was given to them. Another family, new settlers whose wagon had broken an axle, were taken in for a night. A traveler, lost in a storm, found shelter and a warm fire inside the sycamore. Anna never turned anyone away. Her home, born of exclusion, became a place of improbable sanctuary. They never had much, but they always had enough. They were rooted to that place, not by a deed or a title, but by the deep, unshakable bond of having built a life where everyone said none could exist. Years passed. The world outside their small clearing changed. The town grew, new fences went up, and the wild land was slowly tamed. But life in the sycamore tree remained constant, governed by the seasons and the simple truths of survival. The tree itself became more than a shelter, it was a character in their lives, a silent, living partner in their existence. Its broad trunk protected them from the winter wind. Its leaves provided shade in the summer heat. Its very presence was a source of stability in an unstable world. They had not conquered nature, they had found a way to live within it, to become a part of its ancient, breathing life. The question of what makes a home resolved itself not with an answer, but with a lived reality. It was not four walls and a roof built by a stranger. It was not a piece of paper in a bank vault. For them, home was the curve of the wooden wall against your back. It was the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. It was the shared warmth of three bodies huddled together against the cold. It was a place made sacred by the labor and the love that had been poured into it. Their life was a quiet testament to the idea that true ownership is not about possession, but about connection. They belonged to the tree as much as it belonged to them. Martha lived another 8 years in the sycamore. She passed away peacefully one summer afternoon, sitting in her chair in the shade of its branches, her weaving in her lap. She had spent her final years not in the cold charity of a poorhouse, as Mr. Finch's world would have dictated, but as the revered matriarch of a fortress built by her daughter's hands. She was buried on a small rise overlooking the creek, within sight of the tree. Her grave was marked with a simple fieldstone, a monument to a life that had refused to be discarded. Anna and Thomas stayed. They lived in the tree until Thomas was a man, and he married a girl from the town who was not afraid of his strange upbringing but was in awe of it. They eventually built a small cabin nearby, but the tree was always the heart of their homestead, the place where their story began. The great sycamore stood for another 70 years after Anna passed on. It finally fell in a storm in the late 1950s, its ancient wood returning to the earth from which it had grown. By then, the story of the family who lived within it had become a piece of local folklore, a tale told to children about the hardness of the first settlers. But it is more than a piece of folklore. It is a profound meditation on the nature of human resilience. It asks us to look again at the things we believe are essential for our survival. When the structures we rely on, our homes, our finances, our social standing, are stripped away, what is left? Anna, Martha, and Thomas were left with nothing but each other and the earth beneath their feet. And from that, they built not just a shelter, but a legacy. Their story forces us to question our own definitions of wealth, of security, of home. Is a home a thing you buy, or a thing you create? Is strength something you possess, or something you discover in the act of refusing to break? Their lives pose a quiet challenge to a world that often measures worth in assets and acquisitions. They had no assets. They were a liability on a banker's ledger. And yet, they achieved a kind of wealth that Mr. Finch, with all his practicality, could never comprehend. They found a richness in self-sufficiency, a dignity in their connection to the land, and a freedom in living outside the bounds of convention. The story of the Sycamore home is a reminder that the most powerful solutions are sometimes the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting for a gaze clear enough, or desperate enough, to see them. It reminds us that the human spirit, like an ancient tree, can be hollowed out by tragedy and loss, yet continue to reach for the sun. It can continue to grow, to provide shelter, to stand firm against the storm. What forgotten strengths lie dormant within us, waiting for the moment of crisis to be called upon? What unconventional shelters are waiting to be discovered when the walls of our ordinary lives come down?